I had only been gone about 40 minutes, just a quick trip to the hardware store. When I pulled back into my driveway, the first thing that caught my eye was the front door. It wasn't shut all the way. It was slightly open, just a few inches. That alone fell off. I was certain I closed it before I left. Then I heard voices coming from inside. For a second, I wondered if I had forgotten that someone was supposed to stop by. But as I moved closer, I could make out what they were saying. Something about property compliance and documenting violations. That's when it clicked. These weren't friends or guests. They were HOA staff, standing in my living room, looking around like they had every right to be there. And the most unbelievable part? My house isn't even part of their HOA, which meant the conversation that was about to happen was going to get uncomfortable very quickly. The strange thing is, my neighborhood doesn't even have an HOA, at least not the section where my house is located. The development right next to us does. Same builder, same house designs, same entrance road. But about halfway down the street, the HOA boundary ends. My house sits just beyond that line. That was actually one of the main reasons I bought it. No dues, no architectural committee, no letters telling me what color my mailbox should be. When I finalized the purchase, the title documents made it very clear that the property wasn't part of the association. The previous owner even pointed out casually during the walkthrough, saying, "You get the neighborhood feel without the HOA headaches." And for the first year, that's exactly how things were. The HOA board managed the neighborhood behind us, their pool, their clubhouse, their rules, but they never bothered anyone on our side of the street. We'd wave at each other, occasionally borrow tools, just normal neighbor interactions. Then Brenda Kensington took over as HOA president. Within weeks, people inside the association started talking about stricter enforcement. Parking regulations, yard maintenance standards, fence approvals, all the usual HOA stuff. Still, none of that applied to me. Or at least, it wasn't supposed to. A couple of months before the day I found strangers in my living room, I started receiving letters in my mailbox, official-looking HOA notices. At first, I assumed it was just a simple mistake. The envelopes had the HOA logo and were addressed to my house number, but the contents talked about member compliance and community guidelines. I emailed the management company, and they responded saying they'd look into the address issue. After that, the letters stopped, so I figured the mix-up had been resolved. That's why the last thing I expected when I came home that afternoon was to find 2 HOA staff members walking around inside my house like they were conducting an inspection. Whatever confusion they'd had about the address before, this wasn't a small error anymore. They had crossed a line that wasn't even close to their authority. When I pushed the door open the rest of the way, both of them turned and looked at me like I was the one interrupting them. One guy was holding a tablet. The other had a clipboard. They were standing right there in my living room, scanning the place and even taking pictures. For a moment, I just stood there trying to process what I was seeing. Then I asked the obvious question, "What are you doing in my house?" The guy with the tablet calmly replied that they were with the HOA and were conducting compliance inspection, as if that explained everything. I told them my property wasn't part of the HOA. He shook his head and said the house had been flagged for unapproved exterior modifications and that they were also documenting the interior condition. Interior condition. That's when my patience started to wear thin. I asked them how they even got inside in the first place. The other guy said the front door had been unlocked when they arrived and that they had authorization from the association to inspect the property. Authorization from the association. I told them that didn't mean anything here. This house isn't in their community. I don't pay their dues, and I'm not bound by their rules. And even if I were, that wouldn't give anyone the right to walk into someone's home uninvited. As that started to sink in, both of them looked noticeably less confident. The guy with the tablet said Brenda Kensington had personally given them the address and told them the property was part of the community. Now it was starting to make sense. Those letters from a few months ago, the email about reviewing the address. Apparently, no one had actually fixed the mistake. Instead, someone had doubled down on it. I told them they needed to leave immediately. They didn't argue, but they didn't exactly hurry either. The guy with the clipboard said they still needed to finish documenting a few things outside. I told him that wasn't happening either. Because at that point, this wasn't just an HOA misunderstanding anymore. It was two strangers walking through my home and taking photos without permission. And that's the kind of situation where you stop debating policies and start making phone calls. So I stepped outside, pulled out my phone, and called the local sheriff's office. Not to make a scene, but to make it very clear where their authority ended. Because if Brenda Kensington thought she had power over my property before, she was about to learn exactly how far that power didn't extend. About 10 minutes later, a sheriff's deputy arrived. By then, the two HOA staff members were standing near the driveway, talking quietly beside their truck. You could tell they were getting uneasy. What had probably seemed like a routine inspection an hour earlier suddenly didn't feel so routine anymore. The deputy stepped out of his cruiser and asked what was going on. I walked him through everything from the beginning. I told him I'd come home and found two people inside my house, taking photos and claiming they had authority from the HOA to inspect the property. Then I added the detail that made the entire situation so ridiculous. My house isn't even part of their HOA. The deputy nodded and went over to speak with the two men. One of them pulled up a work order on his tablet and showed it to him. It listed my address and referenced an HOA compliance inspection authorized by the association president. The deputy read through it, glanced back at the address, and then asked a simple question. Did the homeowner give you permission to enter the house? Both of them shook their heads. One of them tried to explain that Brenda had told them the property was part of the association and that they had the right to inspect for violations. The deputy didn't argue or raise his voice. He just said, HOA rules don't override private property law. Then he pointed toward my house. That's his home. You don't walk into it without permission. You could see the realization hit them at the same time. This wasn't an HOA issue anymore. It was trespassing. The deputy asked them to step away from the property while he made a quick call to verify the parcel records. A few minutes later, he came back and confirmed exactly what I had been saying the entire time. My property sits outside the HOA boundary. It always has. The address had been incorrectly listed in their internal records, which meant Brenda had sent them to inspect a house the association had absolutely no authority over. At that point, the deputy made it very clear that they needed to leave the property immediately. If there were any disputes about ownership or boundaries, that was something the HOA could handle through proper legal channels. But walking into someone's home because you assume HOA rules apply, that doesn't fly. The two men packed up their things pretty quickly after that. No more photos, no more notes, just an awkward apology about following instructions. And before they drove off, the deputy added one last thing. If the association contacted me again about inspections, they should probably double-check their maps first, because the authority they thought they had that afternoon never actually existed in the first place. The next morning, I woke up to an email from the HOA management company. The subject line read, Address Correction Notice. Apparently, after the sheriff confirmed the property records, someone at the association finally checked the county parcel map themselves. It took them about 5 minutes to confirm what I've been saying all along. My house had never been part of their HOA. Not when it was built, not when I bought it, not ever. The address had simply been added to their internal list of homes by mistake when the neighborhood expanded years earlier, which meant every letter they had sent me, every violation notice, and that entire inspection attempt a day before had all been based on a mistake that somehow lasted for months. The email said they were removing my property from their records immediately and apologized for any inconvenience caused by the misunderstanding. Inconvenience felt like a pretty generous way of describing two strangers walking around inside someone's home. But at least the situation was finally resolved. A couple of days later, I ran into one of the neighbors who actually lives inside the HOA. He told me the board meeting that week had been tense. Apparently, news of the sheriff's visit had made its way back to Brenda Kensington pretty quickly. And when you send staff to inspect a property that isn't even under your authority, and it ends with a conversation involving law enforcement, people tend to start asking questions. A lot of questions. From what I heard, the association quietly updated their property list, clarified the neighborhood boundaries, and made it very clear that any future inspections would require confirmed addresses first, which honestly seemed like common sense from the start. As for my house, everything stopped. No more letters, no more compliance notices, no more inspections, and no more confusion about who actually had authority over property. And in the end, the whole situation turned into a pretty simple reminder. HOAs have rules, but those rules only apply to the people who are actually part of them. The moment they try to enforce those rules outside their own neighborhood, they're not running an HOA anymore. They're just trespassing.